Hello and welcome to the Spring 2024 Improving Restorations webinar series, a collaboration between the University of Minnesota Extension and the State of Minnesota Legacy Fund Restoration Evaluation Program. This is the third in the series of 4 webinars around the theme of restoration and climate. And today we have 2 speakers addressing the topic of contingency planning for restorations. I'm Wade Johnson with the Minnesota DNR, also working on behalf of the Board of Water and Soil Resources on the Legacy Fund Restoration Evaluation Program. Okay, slide is not, there we go. Our program collaborates with experts to evaluate restorations, identifying what's working and ongoing challenges, and working through venues such as this webinar series to inform and improve future restorations. Our collaborating partners on this webinar series are the University of Minnesota Extension. Julie Bonin with Extension is here today with us and will field questions for the Q&A after the presentations. Extension offers an online ecological restoration training certificate program. This 150-hour program of 5 courses is offered twice a year and offers practical skills and knowledge necessary to undertake most kinds of Midwestern restorations. This is an exceptional resource in Minnesota, and I encourage you all to check it out. During the webinar today, as questions and comments arise during the presentation, we encourage you to post questions using the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. There is a chat feature, which you can also use if you have technical issues, but please use the Q&A for questions, and we will have time after both presentations are completed to have Q&A with the speakers. At the end of the webinar today, when you close Zoom, a pop-up will appear prompting you to complete a short survey. Please take a moment to complete this survey. This provides really valuable feedback to us about your interests and potential future webinars. The webinar series will be recorded and available on Extension's websites through the link you see there, the same link that you use to register. The final upcoming webinar in this series is on April 25th, focused on seed sourcing, local mix and match, and assisted migration. Now to introduce our speakers for today. Lucius Jonett is a landscape architect and owner of Midwest Wetland Improvements. Lucius provides technical expertise in stream assessment and restoration and implements projects with a wide variety of stakeholders on environmental conservation and restoration projects. Today, he will be talking about contingency planning for climate change and stream restorations. Then following Lucius, Ben Carlson, the wetland mitigation coordinator with the Minnesota Board of Water and Soil Resources. His role involves working with landowners to establish conservation easements and wetland restoration, restore wetlands and prairie on private lands. Today, he'll be talking about wetland restorations and climate change planning. And with that, Lucius, go ahead and share your screen and take it away.
Lucius, you're on mute.
Never fails. All right. Good
Sounds
afternoon,
good
everybody. Thank you for joining today. I'm going to talk about contingency planning for climate change and stream restorations. Obviously, streams are very important to us as a society, supporting both natural ecosystems and human societies in numerous ways. Including biodiversity, water quality, flood control, recreation and tourism, water supply, habitat connectivity, and cultural and spiritual significance. And so as we kind of contemplate, I'm not going to promise all the answers, but as we think about climate change and the impacts on our stream restoration projects, I wanted to start with just a brief recap or summary of what we are expecting and seeing in Minnesota in regard to climate change. We're generally becoming warmer and wetter with more frequent extreme weather events. that lead to issues like increased flood risk, bigger extremes. But we're also getting longer periods of little to no rainfall between these extreme events. And so we get these very big peak flows, wet, and then very prolonged dry. And so it's impacts streams in many ways. And I just wanted to use this graphic for the stream functions pyramid developed by Will Harmon at Stream Mechanics as kind of a graphic that illustrates the processes that and interdependencies of those processes that help define our streams. And so when we consider those extreme wet events and those long dry events, each one of these levels are impacted just because each one of these levels are dependent on the level below it. So as far as hydrology, we need to have a watershed to gather and provide the water that then moves through the channel in kind of the hydraulic function of the stream. Then working our way up, we get into the geomorphology of how that stream channel is carved and shaped through our landscape, all the way up to the chemical properties and ultimately the biology of what can live in and around those streams. And as we have those changes in our climate, I just started putting some of the factors that are starting to impact our transportation roads of water through our watersheds, our streams. And so just considering precipitation in that watershed, if we have these peak flashy events, of course, that excess is causing flooding issues. But if we're having a lack during one of those drought periods, we're having kind of reduced flows. And if, last year saw a few streams that started going dry as our groundwater kind of went down. And just working our way through, it's these kind of two extremes that keep kind of playing at each level, yet each one of these levels is dependent on the other. So we can really start to see some chaos in our restoration projects that are really hard to plan for and are really kind of out of our control. I don't want to kind of dive into this too much. I want to get to kind of some of the thoughts on, how does climate change impact our stream restoration projects? And all the way from the beginning, are we going to have to start adapting our design approaches? Typically, the streams I see kind of fall into two categories: stabilization of incised channels and more of the stormwater conveyances and kind of the urban and suburban environment. And as we, think of those two extremes, we got more water coming through. And if it's incised, we're wreaking havoc on our stream banks and have to think about kind of our stabilization methods to match those extreme kind of peak shear stresses that are coming. And as we think of that bottom layer of the stream functions, if our watersheds are so saturated, and just thinking of kind of the built environment, and our stormwater BMPs are no longer functioning because they're full, and we're bypassing those, getting even more flow, different water quality. Again, it starts playing with this balance of processes for streams. And on the other side of the projects, where we tend to have a little bit more space, going more of the natural channel design based on our channel forming flows, and then access to the floodplain. When we get bigger flows, we spread it out on the floodplain, so it's a little bit less of a concern. However, if we have these flooding events on our floodplain right after we're doing restoration projects, vegetation is going to be much more difficult to establish. And that is one of the things that we're relying on in our restoration design to get long-term stability. So we definitely don't want to be shorted on that establishment in either the wet events where it's flooding, or kind of the dry extreme where we're cooking and we're not even really getting seed to establish just because it's so dry. So kind of focusing in on the construction and establishment that I was talking about, thinking of the wetter scenario. In construction, it's not stable until it's stable. So as we are getting better at watching our weather forecasts during construction, definitely keeping an eye out for extreme events that are coming, mostly concerned about the extreme wet events. so that we can start to adapt our approach during construction of just, okay, let's stop breaking ground and make sure we stabilize what we have, because we have 3 days until we expect another 8-inch rain event. And then during establishment after construction, are we going to lose all of our revegetation efforts with a big flood event that comes through? Or, irrigation is probably less likely because we're getting excess water. But if we're killing everything because it's drowning, should we plan for additional replanting a year later? And then kind of another approach I've seen is applying warranties on the projects and requiring contractors to provide these warranties. It's an approach I don't necessarily like, because I feel it's kind of unfair. If we're not sure how to finalize our designs for these climate changes, and during construction we're just passing it to a contractor, I feel like that opens the door for kind of a big expense on our projects, and kind of an unfair responsibility to the contractor for something that is really out of their control. And now kind of considering construction and establishment in drier extremes, during construction, it's actually easier. The last 3 years, my projects have been in some pretty dry scenarios, so it's really easy to get into the channel to do dam removals or set flow control structures. And yes, easy to get in there and build them, but it's hard to adjust them because we're lacking that flow. And then in the establishment, it's kind of typical and it's nice that water is usually available if we were going to consider irrigation, assuming that the stream does not go dry. But get into some examples later, but you're going to probably need a DNR water appropriation permit if you're drawing more than 10,000 gallons of water a day. And then talk about the permit that would be required. One of the caveats, though, is should the conditions warrant it, if we get into a drought situation, the DNR could suspend that surface water appropriation permit. So then kind of this contingency plan of we'll just irrigate our vegetation all of a sudden goes away, because we're no longer able to A, get water out of a dry stream, or B, not allowed to draw water out of that stream just because of drought conditions. And so it was kind of a counter of putting a warranty on the contractor. Another way to do that may be to just plan for additional construction and establishment touch-ups, the following spring or fall, if needed. And so I want to introduce 2 of my projects, kind of use them as examples. This Bevins Dam removal project. Picture on the left is just after construction and stabilization, November of 2022. And then 7 months later, we had a dry fall, which is great for construction. And then we also had a dry winter and not a dry winter, we had a dry spring. We thought we were going to get a wet spring, and then it stopped. And so we did not get any establishment in that spring as we anticipated. And preparing for this presentation, I went out last weekend and I saw that there was some vegetation establishment. It looks a little spotty and patchy, but no supplemental watering. Things did establish after 2 years. And then another project, this is more of that natural channel design floodplain excavation project that we finished up last fall. I also stopped out there as well and was not germinating yet, but just a little bit early in the spring. And I'm really curious to see how our spring rolls out, so that we know, what kind of establishment we're going to get, or if we're going to have to go do supplemental follow-up plantings or something like that. And really kind of talking about supplemental watering or irrigation of our restoration projects, I just started putting together kind of what kind of equipment it would take and what kind of costs it might put on our projects. I found some interesting products, gas-powered pump that you could put on the side of the stream, go into irrigation heads or big irrigation guns that can cover 1/3 of an acre in a go. and just kind of putting together some statistics on, okay, if we're going to water an inch, a third of an acre would take 2.5 hours, so that we could put some costs to this. Now, looking at the Bevins Dam project, the first set of numbers is the revegetation effort that we put into those stream banks above the riprap stabilization. And as part of the overall construction budget, that was only just over 3% of the budget. And then, 3% is not a lot. So if we were going to just plan on a follow-up spring or fall planting the following year, adding another $6,000 in a $184,000 project doesn't seem like a big deal. But if we look at the irrigation type system and kind of playing with the number of pumps and the number of heads versus man hours to operate all that, this seemed to be the sweet spot, but it would be an additional almost 12% above the construction budget that we had spent. And the interesting number is if we were to irrigate this project, which had a half acre of disturbance and restoration, 1 inch of watering would require over 13,000 gallons, requiring that water appropriation permit. Likewise, looking at the Carver Creek project, here there was a much bigger disturbance and up to 1.7 acres. And so as expected, our revegetation effort, that first set of numbers again, was 12% of our construction budget of about 170,000. So again, 20% to do that again, or 12% to do that again the following spring or fall, doesn't seem like that big of a deal if you have the money, of course. And then running through the same irrigation exercise, if we were to water this, assuming that we're going to irrigate 13 times over the season, kind of once every other week, just making an assumption, it would be an additional 15% or $25,000 above the current construction budget that we spent. And so it's kind of like, well, now we're kind of 50-50. Do we reseed or do we just irrigate and try and hope that we take some of the chance out of relying on Mother Nature's rain to kind of fall? So just as a quick recap of the two projects, and I only did two, this isn't necessarily an industry standard, but if we were to look at these follow-up work, is it construction work, like flood that moved a bunch of materials around or unwrapped a bunch of stabilization? That's something I didn't necessarily talk about, but is that something we should be budgeting for? Or should we be budgeting for revegetation, or we'll say follow-up planting, not just assuming that it always fails every time, but that 5% to 15% of project cost, just planning on doing that twice? Or do we want to control kind of our destiny, put out this irrigation system, which is going to require a lot of hours, contractor hours, or project sponsor hours, somebody to go out there for another 12 to 15% of additional project cost? And of course, projects, we tend to run our budgets right to the max. We don't want to leave a lot of the grant funding behind these projects on the table. But I think we need to start keeping some of that room. And it's like, well, that doesn't seem fair. Like, the budget's the budget. But if we're involved in putting together 30% design concepts, that's the time to start including that supplemental work to kind of make room for some of these contingencies and kind of making sure our restoration projects have the best chance of success. I believe we're saving questions until after the next presentation, but be happy to answer those when we get to that.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Lucius. That's very informative in terms of giving us an example of the dynamics of some of these projects. Thank you for that. Okay, moving on to our next presentation from Ben Carlson with the Board of Water and Soil Resources. Ben, go ahead and share your screen.
Sure, you bet. Okay. Okay, are you seeing seeing the slides? Looks good.
Yep, that looks good. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. So to kind of continue with what Lucius was talking about as far as climate change planning, my focus is on wetland restoration. So how we design our sites, how do we account for like large scale rain events, drought, establishing seed, just kind of how do we deal with that as far as getting our projects established. So I'll quickly talk kind of about wetland restoration or wetland banks. From our end, what anytime we restore a wetland is typically for a wetland bank, and what a wetland bank is restoring or creating wetland to be used to provide mitigation to offset wetland impacts. So if you fill in a wetland, drain in a wetland, excavate a wetland, that's considered a wetland impact, and you have to provide mitigation to offset those impacts. So Minnesota, we have over 600 recorded wetland bank easements throughout the state, and Minnesota is unique in the sense that we have more wetland banks than any other state in the country by far, like by quite a bit. So that's kind of a cool fact. And Bowser, the agency I work for, we generate wetland banks for impacts associated with local road projects known as LIGR work, local government road wetland replacement program. So that's my role, is to just generate credits for road projects. And so credit, easy way to think of a credit is if you restore an acre of wetland, you get an acre of credit. If you restore 2 acres of wetland, you get 2 credits, and so on. So that's a very high level, kind of easy way to think about it. There's more to it, but that's generally kind of what we're talking about here. So again, for road projects, I generate credits to be used for to provide mitigation for wetland impacts for road projects. Currently, we have 14 active banks being monitored. They were all constructed in the last 5 years. And then I'm working on 8 banks right now that are in various phases of development, should be constructed either this year or next year. So, and then once a bank is constructed or established, we generally monitor it for up to 5 years. Rarely less, sometimes more, depending on how well it's establishing. So banks are tied to performance standards, meaning certain conditions have to be met before we're allowed to release those credits to be used. Credits cannot be released until performance standards are met. And if you look at the table, we have for each type of community, like wet meadow, shallow marsh, deep marsh, we have various performance standards that need to be met in order to generate or release those credits. So, and we have mitigation or performance standards for both hydrology and vegetation. So again, kind of circling back to climate change, if we have complications due to flooding, due to drought, due to invasive species, how do we address that, or how do we design our sites to account for that? So this is a pretty typical, I'm going to get the laser pointer here going. Oops, let me try this. Laser pointer, all right. Kind of standard site design. We have engineers that design the site. This is a pretty typical one. When we're doing wetland restoration, kind of the idea is we're trying to restore the hydrology of the site first. We want to hold more water on site and for a longer duration. I don't know if you can see this, but so this currently is a farm site. It's about 170 acres, give or take. For the last century or so, it's been farmed. There's quite a bit of drain tile. These lines are all the drain tile. So right now the site's drained. They're able to farm it. All the hydrology is removed and just dumps into like public tile systems. So what we do is we assess the site. We look at where all the tile is. And to restore the hydrology, we do a number of tile breaks. Like here's a tile break. Here's a tile break. Here's a tile break. So what we're trying to do is hold more water on site for a longer period. The challenge with that is not affecting neighboring properties. You know, we don't want to flood the neighbors out. If we get a large rain event, how do we handle that? This site in particular has a very large berm that we're constructing that in this site, everything flows from south to north. And from south end to north end, it drops about 12 feet in elevation. So if you do get a big rain event, you could get quite a bit of flow across here. So everything flows through this wetland, and the intent of this berm is to kind of manage water on site. If that weren't there, all the water would just flow to the north, stack up against the road, and there's a road here. Water would overtop the road, flood the neighbor to the north. That's bad. We don't want to do that. So we designed these structures to account for that large precipitation events and just kind of manage water on site. So how we design our sites, we look at precipitation information, like Atlas 14. We look at 2-year, 10-year, 25-year, 100-year events. And if you're not familiar with that, it's like a 2-year event in this area in a 24-hour period. If you got 2.69 inches of rain, that happens at a frequency of every 2 years. And same with 10-year, 3.9. And a storm event of that magnitude, in theory, only happens every 10 years. Kind of what we're seeing with climate change is we're getting much larger events more frequently. So, again, how do we account for that? Then when we design our site, we look at like our let me go back to this one for example, wetland 3 is kind of the large wetland. We establish a normal pool elevation for that wetland. So the normal pool for that one is 1091.5. And then we look at, okay, if we had a 2-year event, a 10-year event, or 100-year event, how much water would then be held on site? How much flooding would that cause? Are we going to affect the neighbors in any way? So how do we account for that? So for that one wetland, like I said, we're proposing like an embankment along the north end. So we do have an outlet structure. The outlet structure bottom is set at that 1091.5. So that's the normal outlet. So under normal conditions, water is just going to trickle out of there, and that's fine. However, when we have large events, what we do is we incorporate an emergency overflow that's typically set about a foot higher than the normal pool. So that allows, if we do have a large event or a number of larger events back to back, the site can handle that. What we don't want is water overtopping this berm. It could cause it to erode, could collapse, fail, things like that. So this emergency overflow is kind of designed to kind of like a safety relief valve, essentially. So, and then we have structures that ultimately every site needs some sort of outlet. Where's all this water going to go eventually? So we have outlet structures. Here's a pretty typical one, like a box structure. This picture was actually taken, I think, in July of 2022 during a drought. Water level is really low. You can see normally the water is up to almost near the top of the structure. So that's just kind of what it looks like in a drought setting. So here's kind of an internal view of the structure itself. We have, they're called stop logs, and each of these are about 6 inches in height, and we can pull these out to adjust water levels. So typically how these work is water enters the structure, and then this is the internal weir. So for water to leave, it has to go over this wall. And then on the back side of the structure is in the outlet pipe, kind of what you're seeing here. So this is standing water, enters the structure, goes over the weir wall, and then goes down the outlet. So what's nice about our structures is we're able to adjust these just in case if we do have a really large event and we need to get water out of here faster. We can pull these drop logs out or stop logs out, drop the water, or if we're having drought, then we have all the logs in to hold as much water on site. We also do this for vegetation management. Sometimes if you're struggling to get vegetation to establish around the fringe of the wetland, we'll pull a few logs out to drop the water level, and then we'll do live plantings along the fringe. Generally, we're dropping the water in the range of 30 to 60 days to allow the vegetation to get established, and then we'll put those logs back in and raise the water level. So that's kind of one technique that we use. So as far as vegetation goes, it's really important to plant at appropriate times, kind of phasing the vegetation. Most of our sites, we do a fall or dormant seed. We found that with wetlands, established vegetation, generally that works the best. A lot of wetland seed needs like a freeze-thaw cycle in order to germinate. And Also, the freeze thaw cycle and snow will kind of pack or work the seed into the ground. We have done some snow seeding. That can work well. The conditions have to be right. Generally, you're doing that, in like February or March, where you have a little bit of snow and you can just broadcast the seed right onto the snow, and then the seed will kind of work its way down into the soil. So that works. You can do spring plantings. We found for wetland establishment, fall plantings generally work the best. For upland, you can do spring or fall, either works. Generally, if you do a fall planting, that favors forbs. If you do a spring planting, the grass seems to do a little bit better. So again, it depends on what you're trying to establish. Flood prone sites. So this is a bank we're working on. It's northwest of Roseau, Minnesota. To the right is the Roseau River. To the left is the actual bank. This was May of 2022. So the bank is about 560 acres from one side to another. It's 2 miles across. We haven't done the seeding yet. We're in the process of getting it developed, but seed cost alone is going to be about $600,000. Wetland seed is generally about $1,000 an acre. Upland seed, I don't know the exact amount, but probably close to half that. So anyway, if you were to seed this site in the fall and the following spring it floods, you might have issues of a lot of your seed getting washed away. You don't want that. Costs a lot of money. You have to redo it. So usually in flood prone sites, we wait till either the flooding has subsided or the chance of flooding kind of has subsided. So maybe, at least in this area, late May, early June, usually by then we're kind of in the clear of not having to worry about flooding. So pretty wild. Like when I was up here, I don't know if you've ever been up to the Roseau area, but it's flat as can be. From, like I said, the site's 2 miles across, and from one side to the other, it drops 2 feet in elevation across 2 miles. So it's about as flat as you can get. So when it does flood, the only thing that's not underwater is pretty much roads or houses. It's pretty wild. So just kind of a note on, the last few years, we've had kind of drought conditions. The wetlands seem to be doing okay. We haven't had a whole lot of issues with wetland vegetation. The buffers and prairies, at least what we've seen, have been really struggling. We've had to redo a few prairies. Again, we got to meet those performance standards. You have to have a certain amount of natives present, and it's struggling to get that with how dry it's been. So this is a bank up by Detroit Lakes. It's about a 190 acre bank. About 70 acres of upland, and we had to just start from scratch. We last summer sprayed it, burned it, reseeded it in the fall, and so this year we're kind of starting over. So Lucius kind of talked about this, factor in like supplemental seeding. What we do, we usually add about a 20% contingency. We just kind of we pad the budget a little bit just to account for having to do some additional seeding. Like I just said, if there's drought, you could have poor growth, or if there's flooding, you might get areas that get drowned out. That can be an issue. One thing we've noticed in a lot of our upland or buffer areas, there can be, most of our sites were previously ag fields that have been sprayed by herbicide for the last, several decades. And a lot of the upland areas can have like a residual herbicide effect. And we're actually dealing this with one site now. We wanted to seed it this spring, but we looked at the herbicide the farmer used last year, and the herbicide indicated it had a residual effect of 12 to 18 months. So actually what we're doing is we're planting oats as a cover crop to help control the weeds. And then this fall we'll do the final seeding. So take into, if it has been farmed, look at what herbicides were used. What I wanted to mention, like our sites are massive, they're generally 100, 200, 500 acres. So if there is a drought, trying to water that just is not an option. It's just simply too big. So you just kind of have to deal with what Mother Nature gives you. So again, you might have some erosion issues with larger precipitation events. So you might have to do some regrading, reseeding, things like that. Dealing with invasives. Some invasives do better in drought conditions or flooding conditions. So trying to manage that. But all our sites, we're going out doing herbicide applications, mowings, burnings, things like that to just try to manage the vegetation. And you have to adapt your strategies. Like I said, some sites, if you're in a drought, some weeds might thrive in drought, so you might have to clip those or do some mowings. This is another site up by Roseau. It's about 400 acres. We were having some issues with vegetation there with like sweet clover. The site became really, so Virginia wild rye is native, but it was pretty aggressive. Probably about 80 to 90% of the site was just Virginia wild rye, and it was kind of choking everything out. So we ended up asking the landowners to bale the site. And this is like the largest mountain of hay bales I've ever seen. It's just massive. So haying can help assist with reseeding. It could allow sunlight to get to the ground to help other species come more established. Again, invasives, probably our biggest issue in wetland areas are cattails, like the hybrid or narrow leaf cattail. We're constantly just battling those. And again, those species are really tall, they can handle drought, they can handle flooding. They're really hard to kill. So anyway, that is all I got. Let me escape. And I forgot to turn on my video. Sorry. Okay.
That's all right. You can turn it on now for the questions.
Here we go. Start video. There we go.
All right. Let's have a little Q&A. We had a few questions from everyone, but feel free to continue to add your questions to the Q&A. And we'll be taking those for the next several minutes here. So plenty of time to get them in. But we have a couple to get us started. Let's start with Lucius. On the stream restoration projects, how do you decide whether or not to install linear construction stormwater best management practices parallel to the water's edge?
That is something I almost always do, especially if it's a bank that we're building, anything where we have disturbed soils, even if we compact it back into place, I always cap that with an erosion control blanket, and then make sure we have a hydro mulch for areas outside. So freshly disturbed soils, and then where I anticipate flow, which is obviously changing, kind of raising a little higher now, but just want to prevent erosion and want to kind of lock our seed down and hold that in place as long as we can.
So you are extending the widths of those bands as well now, given more current conditions.
Yeah, it's something we got to think about if it's going to continue that purpose of kind of holding things in place for stability and stabilization and revegetation. Sorry.
Okay. And then another question for you then. So when you're using the irrigation, would you use that for, and maybe you haven't done different types of plant materials, but the question is, would you do the same for tree and shrub plantings as you would for herbaceous seeded, so grasses, forbs? Would you use the irrigation, the supplemental irrigation for both types of projects?
Yeah, that's a great question. Full disclaimer, I have not done supplemental irrigation on any restoration project yet. Throw that in there. And one of the kind of self-judgments against my own designs is I don't feel like I do enough shrub and tree plantings either. Especially where we do a lot of tree removals to clear access for construction, kind of as the landscape architect looking back at some of these park projects going, man, we really didn't put any trees back. Something we want to do that. I don't know that I would change the strategy. If we're going to do irrigation, I think it would cover everything, all types of revegetation.
And quickly then, speaking of trees and shrubs, do you do any stem cuttings? So dormant cuttings of willow and dogwood, things like that. And I'm thinking particularly like to kind of mask some of the riprap ever.
Yes, I definitely have. I personally have gotten away from the shrub cuttings a little bit just because of the window. Kind of the harvesting window is larger than the installation window. And with our projects, we're doing stream projects year round, kind of based as we can around spawning restrictions in the channel, and just kind of a lot of strategery on how do we access sites. You know, sometimes it's better to go in when it's frozen. Sometimes it's better to go in as soon as we can. And so instead of the shrub cuttings, I prefer shrubs that have been planted in deep cell pots. Originally, they were called like shrub bands, and then the different names have evolved, but it's basically a narrow, long, think of like a oversized test tube that the shrub has been grown in, so that when you transplant that, you can still kind of pilot your hole, and then you slide the whole established root system in there.
Okay.
Now, costs, it's about 3 times the expense, but I find it to be 3 times as successful.
Okay. Cost benefit. Ben, let's stick with some planting stock questions for you. Do you consider using plugs at all for any of your revegetation efforts? And is there a difference whether you're using seed or plugs to promote biodiversity?
Yep. So generally we start with seed. So kind of the order in which we do things is, before we restore the hydrology on the site, that's usually we seed. The wetlands are the first thing we seed, and then the uplands, and then we do the tile breaks. So we restore the hydrology, because doing seeding wetlands, if you broadcast seed in standing water, it usually doesn't work very well. A lot of wetland seed floats. So if you broadcast wetland seed in water, it's all going to blow to one side, and one side will look really good and one side will look really bad. So we try to get the seed in before we do the hydrology, and then based on how successful, like some sites do really well, some don't. The sites that aren't doing well, if we have generally like shallow marsh or deep marsh, then we'll draw water levels down, do live plugs, depending on how large an area we got to do, how well the site is doing. That depends on how many plugs we install. So yes, we definitely do both. Plugs, it's a lot more expensive, a lot more labor intensive, so we try to rely on seed as much as possible. But again, to try to, if we're not meeting performance standards, then we'll plan B is live plugs. So
okay. Can you give me a sense of, you talked about your sites can be 100, 200, 500 acres. Of those mitigation sites, what is kind of percentage of upland to wetland typically?
generally, we try to do at least 50-50. The more wetland, the better. I mean, some sites, like one up in Roseau, is 100% wetland. There's no upland. It's just one huge wetland. Generally how we get our projects is we do a request for proposal. We'll get money from the legislature, and then we'll send out an RFP for people who want to sign up. We do it through a conservation easements. So we find sites that are eligible or suitable. We purchase a conservation easement from the landowner. But to answer your question, usually it's a minimum 50-50. We want, because how the wetland crediting works is if you have excess buffer, you're not getting credit for that. You don't get credit you get a little bit of credit for the upland, but only so much. So generally 50-50 at a minimum.
So, and that leads me to a couple more questions.
Sure.
And I'll throw this to both of you. I'll let you both have a chance at this, but do you feel like the constraints of grants and the requirements for mitigation are currently working for the types of projects that you are doing now, given the contingencies you need to try to implement for climate change? So do you think that the window of timing that you have is long enough, given the constraints that you are required to meet? Do you know what I mean? So like if you have a LCCMR grant, it's a 2-year grant typically. Is that a long enough time frame to accomplish your projects?
Sure. So all our wetland banks aren't grant funded. It's we get money from the legislature, so Bowser is statutorily obligated to provide mitigation for road related projects. So we're required to get money in order to do our projects. We get money from the legislature. 2 years ago, we got $0. Last year, we got 13 million. So it varies. So we occasionally get money to do our projects, and we're not confined by any like grant funding or anything like that. So we get the money and we do our projects to the extent possible, or as however many projects we can do with that money. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, and for your project, it sounds like there's a 5-year window to try to meet the requirements?
Correct. Yep. So generally, yep, typically we monitor for 5 years. So how it works is once a bank is constructed, it's seeded, we have to mark the easement corners or the easement lines with placards. So once all that's done, then we can meet with we have to meet with the Army Corps of Engineers, local government units, and to certify it. So once it's certified, then we can do the initial 15% deposit, meaning, so if the site's going to generate 100 credits, we would then be able to deposit 15. And then we have to monitor, generally it's the first 2 years of monitoring, we have to do hydrology monitoring. If we're meeting the hydrology performance standards, then we can do the hydrology release, which is anywhere from 20 to 35%. And then, and then again, after 2 years, we can do the initial vegetation, the interim 1 it's called. After 3 years, it's interim 2. And then after 4 years, interim 3. And then the 5th year is the final. We do an actual wetland delineation and define the area of wetland. So each kind of there's steps each year allowing us to release credits.
And you're being able to meet those even despite, these changes that we're experiencing with, these frequent flood events and things like that.
Short answer is yes. We do have some sites that, a lot of them have, like, kind of what earlier I was talking about, the prairies, the buffers have been really struggling. We've had to restart those. So we have a few sites that we're in year 3, 4, 5, and the prairie has not generated any credit because it's just been bad. The wetlands have been doing pretty good. So.
Okay.
Yep.
And Lucius, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think kind of conversely, most of the stream restoration projects in Minnesota are grant funded to get those accomplished. So we definitely feel pressure on kind of the grant cycle ending, or the funding going away. And kind of thinking of stream restoration projects, we pick it up and then we start the regulatory review could take 6 to 12, maybe 18 months, depending on complexity of the project. So that doesn't leave a lot of window left to complete the construction or kind of come back and do a warranty additional touch-up work, whatever that is, construction or vegetation. However, we find that it's usually pretty generous in getting an extension, for these kind of good reasons of we're going to add some of these contingencies, or we got stuck. You add an EAW onto a project because you do a big remeander that triggers the thresholds. That adds even another 3 to 6 months on top of the normal permit review. So it does get tight, but it usually isn't the end of the world when we ask for an extension.
Okay. And we have a question here, the idea of the portable watering systems, so the irrigation systems. Are there any opportunities, you think, to potentially purchase or have a system available that could be leased out to organizations that would be doing restoration?
Absolutely. I think it's a lot of repeat equipment. So it's just, an initial investment. And then I think the biggest challenge is really going to be who's manning the pumps and kind of helping oversee that. But, at the same time, I was really looking I know there's like remote irrigation controls for, yards and golf courses. So it's like, I don't know, other than making sure that there's fuel, like, is there a renewable energy source, even if there's no electricity, so it kind of sparked some thoughts as I was putting this presentation together. I'm like, yeah, I think maybe there is a market of kind of covering a lot of these projects, assuming the water's there. And then
Right.
it's not so big, like Ben was talking about, there's definitely going to be a tipping point of what's realistic and achievable.
Ben, do you have any thoughts on that? It sounds like water would be useful for some of your projects.
Yeah, oh, man. Again, it's so many of our sites are very remote and just so big that it just really, even just doing vegetation management, we struggle, like, because to apply herbicide, you have to mix with water. And we actually ran into that last year where they needed to spray about 70 acres. They were redoing the buffer, had to spray about 70 acres, and it was up by north of Detroit Lakes, and they were struggling to find a water source, even just for herbicide.
Okay.
So yeah, watering our sites just is not, they're so big, it wouldn't be practical. The cost and feasibility would be really challenging.
Have you had to modify any of your plans due to, we've had a good 3 years now of drought? Do you kind of look at that and say, maybe we're not going to seed a site this year because it's just too risky? Like looking at a forecast?
I wouldn't say we've modified our seeding. Like I said, usually we do in the fall. That's typically when we seed the wetlands. And our hope is, you can't predict how much snow we're going to get. So we kind of roll the dice and do it in the fall and hope we have a decent winter, good, the snow push the seed in the ground, good seed contact, freeze thaw cycle, things like that. But yeah, I don't think we've delayed seeding or anything like that I can recall. Mm-hmm.
What are the current thoughts been on the functionality of created versus native wetlands in terms of making choices about when wetlands are destroyed and when they're not, versus restoring them using the banking system?
Sure. Well, so when we do, in the past, a lot of mitigation came through wetland creation, doing like on-site or project-specific mitigation, and we've learned that just doesn't work really well. They usually would be very small. You're talking an acre or less, trying to recreate or create wetland in an area that wasn't historically wetland. So what we do, and there's been a shift kind of in thinking, is trying to recreate what historically was wetland. So most of our sites are in the southern or western part of the state. And if people don't know this, about 90% of wetlands have been drained since European settlement in that area. So massive loss of wetland. So there's a lot of opportunity to try to restore or recreate what it was historically. And based on that, we're finding that the restoring or recreating or reestablishing wetland is much better. And we usually, generally the larger the project, the better. You get just more diversity, various wetland types. And we've done a number of studies that show restored wetlands over time, they closely mimic natural wetlands. And that being said, vast majority of wetlands in the southern and western part of the state, naturally occurring wetlands, are highly degraded. They're full of reed canary grass, cattail, just invasive species. And our banks are held to a very high standard. We generally have to have at least 80% native vegetation. So oftentimes the vegetation in our banks is better than like a naturally occurring wetland. And then the hydrology is there too. So
and that's looking at it by cover, right?
Yep, exactly.
80% cover.
Yep, relative cover, correct. Yep.
Okay.
And then depending on the, like, wet meadow has to have at the end has to have 20 different species, and shallow and deep marsh have to have, I think it's 7 different species. So, which generally, again, looking at our banks, oftentimes they have more diversity than a naturally occurring wetland. So.
Another question we had was, does Bowser budget for perpetual management of the wetland banks, or how does that work?
Yep. So we do have, so in addition to us creating banks, Bowser manages, there's a public or a private banking system. So landowners can establish a wetland or a wetland bank on their property, and then they sell the credits to like developers or whoever needs to impact wetland. Part of that process there are fees that were like a yearly maintenance, like a easement fee, a deposit fee. So we have all these fees that we just kind of put into a pool, and then that's part of our plan, is a long-term management plan, meaning once the 5 years is over, we still go back every 3 to 5 years, look at the site, see if the vegetation's looking good, or the structure is still intact. Are there any like rodent issues? Like, did muskrats burrow through a berm and now it's leaking? So we have a pool of money set aside to address those issues. So.
Great, thanks. Lucius,
Mhm.
I'm going to throw another question in your direction. Do you have any suggestions for strategies for budgeting for projects now, given that we know we need these contingencies for, you know, flood events that wash out your seed, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, I think if we're lucky enough to, well, a lot of the times on the projects, we'll do a feasibility study and kind of put together the budget, which ultimately goes to the grant application to fund the rest of design and construction. So I think that's like the easy prime target to start was, let's just start doing it, like just putting in that contingency, controlling the budget ourselves for these projects. In the case where we aren't doing a feasibility study or it's coming, it's an emergency repair or something where you just got to get to it a little bit faster or something. I think it's, when I put those costs together, it's not a huge dollar amount compared to all the other money we're investing in, hard materials if needed, or harvesting trees for large wood if needed, and, even the erosion controls, like the plant materials itself is a very small percentage. So I don't think it's unrealistic. We include monitoring sometimes. We usually don't do that either. But, so if we start adding these contingency funds for, well, let's just come back, is that something we're going to end up dipping into as well, like monitoring or not? But I think it's just time to start.
Do you find that you ever have
And if we
to
don't
go in
use
and
it,
redo? Oh, sorry, keep going.
oh, I was just gonna say, and if we don't use it, then let's put that into the monitoring bucket finally.
Okay. Do you find that you do have events that wash out some of the hard structure? You know, the riprap and things like that? Do you have to go in and redo that ever?
I've been pretty lucky. I'll knock on the wood table. That has not happened in a major way for me personally, but I've heard, the horror stories, and um, yes, it happens. And depending on the design intent, and that's why I included that slide of what kind of a project is it. If it's like an incised system where you're really fixed, you're not getting to that floodplain, that's where I'd be more apprehensive or expecting like might have to go fix something versus doing kind of the natural channel design, like where we intentionally want things to hit the floodplain and spread out. I've seen, I did a DNR training, and the example project we are going to go look out at the next day was hit with like a 10-inch rain overnight. And there was no field work because it was flooding and it was kind of raging through. But once it all settled down, like it works. And so kind of using the right design technique when possible helps mitigate having to go and manually reconstruct.
Great. We are at 1 o'clock. So I'd like to thank both of our speakers and our audience. Thank you for the questions. Thank you for the presentations. It's been great. And be sure to join us for the final webinar in a couple of weeks.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's fun. Love it.